Hi. So I'm Nicolas Gallagher, and I work at Twitter as a front-end engineer, mainly CSS architecture stuff. I'm going to talk about the history of an open source project that I work on called HTML5 Boilerplate. What I learned about front-end development while I was working on it, thoughts that have come up that I have based on my experiences working on it, and how some of them might apply to corporate development roles, and how I'm trying to work some of them into what I do at Twitter. So I work on these projects primarily at the moment. I'll cover HTML5 Boilerplate and Normalize as I talk a bit more. Suit is a experimental toolkit that I'm working on that's a collection of small, modular, structural HTML and CSS components that's designed to work with a package manager. It's an approach to try and make it a bit easier to build large UIs on large, complicated web apps. And I used an early version of it on TweetDeck, which seemed to go down pretty well. I've been keeping in touch with them over the last 6 months to see how it goes. And idiomatic CSS is sort of a template, a CSS code style guide that I wrote. So HTML5 Boilerplate, I'm at the moment the lead developer on HTML5 Boilerplate. It's a really popular front-end template to help people get started with the basics of building web apps and sites. It comes bundled with popular JavaScript libraries, some base CSS, some server configuration settings for Apache to get people started with caching and gzipping. And it's relatively agnostic of any higher level development philosophy or framework that people want to use, so it works pretty well with as a base that other things can build upon. And it's the it's the result of combined effort for many years and community involvement and blah, blah, blah. And it's hosted on GitHub, which is a popular code sharing site. If you're not familiar with it, it's where I think the majority of front-end open source code is being hosted at the moment. And HTML5 Boilerplate is the 4th most starred repository on that, on GitHub, behind just Twitter Bootstrap, which is a UI toolkit, Node, and jQuery. And it's been used by a bunch of notable names, such as these ones, Google, Microsoft, Twitter, so on. But countless other websites, ranging from really small to relatively large, and many frameworks have included it as part of what they do. So they just build upon it, and it's just part of their wider set of opinionated approaches to do things. So I'm very fortunate to have worked on this. Had many developers who've helped work on it, many developers who have contributed to it. It's very much like the product of community effort and the accumulation of all kinds of knowledge from around the place. And as you can see from the companies using it, the use of open source and the publishing of open source front-end work is really taking off. And this is increasingly where people make their first strides into being a front-end developer, will be contributing to some open source project that they worked on while they're still hobbyists. And it might be the first place that most people do any kind of teamwork or work with other skilled developers on projects. And so more and more companies are sourcing developers from their work on open source projects like me. That's how I ended up working at Twitter, from working on HTML5 Boilerplate, Normalize, initially submitting some bugs and patches for Bootstrap. And so more and more of these developers, when they end up in corporate roles, are expecting the positive aspects of open source work to exist in the role that they take up in their company. So I'm going to look at how this small, focused open source project, what it did well, what it was successful in doing, how it goes about maintaining the quality of its code, how it goes about distributing the teamwork and the responsibility for various bits and pieces, how it tries to maintain a group of a large number of people who use the project and then who come back to contribute to it, and how it stays relevant as the environment of front-end development continues to change and how it's changing very rapidly at the moment. So it started in about 2010 by Paul Irish, who works at Google, Divya Manian, who works at Adobe, and a guy called Rob Larson, who works predominantly on the build script that existed in the project at the time. And it's always had the aim of being a generic starting template for web projects. So they're looking for a variety of names at the time. One of them was Pro Front-End Template. My favorite was Markup, Zygote, which I can't understand why they didn't use that, but they settled on HTML5 Boilerplate. And the early features included just standard things you'd expect, I suppose, these days, like boilerplate HTML to get started with web app development, focused around the sort of simpler notation that HTML5 introduced, some starting CSS, so a reset to sort of clear the ground, some base code, helper classes to help with like common things like hiding text or making it accessible to screen readers, placeholder media queries for responsive work, JavaScript libraries, so jQuery and Modernizer. Modernizer is a feature detection library, if you're not familiar with it, and a build script that was written in Ant, and a test framework, which at the time was QUnit, and some like boilerplate QUnit tests. And it had a few other things like touch icons for various mobile devices and things like that, just to get people in a space where they're aware of the dimensions of images they'd need, which platforms they were useful for, and a few other bits and pieces like that. But this is already quite a lot of features for what was meant to be like boilerplate code, like a starting template. A lot of it's quite opinionated, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. So we started removing things. And the first thing to go was the test framework. We kind of handed out surveys to the people using it, like, please tell us how you're using this project. And most people never used the test framework. And those that did use test frameworks, they didn't want to be using QUnit a lot of the time. So because there were so many different options, and it was changing all the time, we couldn't really make informed decisions of which test framework to include any given month. We just decided that this wasn't a problem we needed to solve, so we just remove it. And this kind of removed the need for us to worry about that and just left it up to other people and more opinionated stacks built on top of the project to decide which framework they wanted to include. We did the same with the build script, which was a major source of bugs for us. About 80%, I think, of all of our bugs were related to the build script. And again, most people never used it, and the people who were trying to use it were novices and were struggling to deal with some of the problems with the build script, and we didn't have very many people working on it. So getting rid of it was kind of a no-brainer. But we didn't completely just remove it. We moved it into a standalone project to try and decouple it from HTML5 boilerplate in general, make it easier for that to become a generic tool that wasn't tied to the specific HTML that we were supplying to people, and to try and get more people to come and work on that as a generic build script solution for people who wanted to use Ant in whichever environment it was that they were building their project. And very much like the test framework, there are all kinds of build script solutions, and ours was just one. And this was something that, as time went on, we didn't want it to be part of the project because we felt it was too opinionated. And especially for a front-end project, at the time that Node was kind of really taking off and more tools were being written in Node, Ant was no longer a clear choice. So at the time that we moved the build script into its own project, another build script managed by the sort of super organization that HTML5 Boilerplate is part of also appeared, and that was written in Node, which is easier for front-end developers to work on, and that went on to spawn some other interesting projects that I'll touch on. And then hot pink was a contentious thing in the early days of HTML5, which was a custom text selection color. So when you kind of copy and paste a piece of text, as you copied that text, you'd get something that looked like this appearing over your website. And that was included in the default CSS and became increasingly problematic. So the final straw was when it turned up on a few high-profile websites, including this one, which was a teaser site for the film Prometheus. So Prometheus, if you're not aware of it, is like set in the alien universe, like dark sci-fi movie or whatever. And this was part of the Wayland Industries kind of like viral site, which, as you can see, is meant to look dark and foreboding and industrial. But then when you try and copy a piece of text, you'd get this. And this was about the same time that ABC News released their new blogs, and they also had this problem. So you've got some important piece about like some murders, and then someone copies a piece, and you get this coming up. So yeah, it wasn't really something that we could keep around for much longer. And we'd had many discussions about removing this in the past, but they always kind of descended into flame wars with many heated opinions. People sort of clung to this hot pink as the only way to identify that a site was written using HTML5 boilerplate, as if that mattered, or that it was just some way of knowing that someone was a bad developer, because how could someone who built this like technical site be competent if they'd left this in? Which I don't agree with any of those opinions, but it led to this very cliquey community where the hot pink meant something. It was like something human that they wanted to retain. But the consequence of that was problems like this. So eventually we had to ignore the noisy majority and just remove it. And when I did, there were 92 comments on the commit that removed this. So it was still, like at the time, something that people wanted to chip in on. But in the end, like, everyone got on with their lives, and the project was better for it. And so, as the project became more and more like agnostic of certain things, like build script, we didn't care what you used. That was up to something else to solve. Test framework, again, not really our problem. We were already using jQuery and Modernizer, which were separate libraries. We started to explore breaking the project up into even more pieces and creating these kind of spin-off libraries, which I think is, at least for us, it was a really useful way to work. And at Twitter, we do some similar things. So the first was this project called Normalize, which was, if you know CSS, reset, then that is a way of just like flattening out all the inconsistencies between browsers by basically making everything look the same, or that's the idea anyway. And this was an alternative to resets that I wrote and originally co-created with someone called Jonathan Neal. And this was basically how I got involved in HTML5 Boilerplate in the first place. Their original CSS was a mix of reset, pieces of code taken from YUI's library, just all thrown in together. Not particularly well commented, and turned out it hadn't really been tested. So when I went poking around, and they're like, what's this for, what's that for? No one really had any answers. And so I sort of started testing every line and working out what needed to be there and what didn't. And through the process of doing that, along with Jonathan, we kind of ended up creating this thing called Normalize, which is, it does a few things very well, which is it has a much clearer purpose than a reset, which is it's just trying to provide consistent rendering without removing the useful defaults that browsers provide. It also tries to avoid creating surprises, like things like the infamous focus reset that the first version of reset had, which basically was an accessibility problem where everyone using a keyboard, there were no focus styles on links. And it also tries to provide like heavily commented code. So I think almost every line in the code explains what it's there for, which is important for CSS because you can write a line of code that actually does something completely different to what it's saying. And like one of them is to allow text inheritance on a legend in a form, which is a form element. You have to set the border to 0, which is a way of kind of like, I don't know why, but that affects color inheritance in IE. So there's no way to know that without putting comments, and this is generally the case with a lot of CSS, which is a lot of it is hacking or doing things that are more than just the obvious, like 20 pixels of padding or whatever. So it's very clear why things are there, which hopefully makes it easier for people to get involved or to notice when things can be stripped out because browser support is changing. And it also provides some support for mobile browser normalizations and includes a test HTML file to help identify regressions. And this was good for HTML5 Boilerplate as well because it meant that another project could deal with the issue of providing a simple CSS baseline. They didn't have to manage all of those issues as well. So we just sent off to Normalize now every time an issue comes up. It also makes it much easier to switch out Normalize for a reset if that's what you want to use, or for your own custom starting point or some starting point that hasn't been written yet, because it's just a single file that we replace and then everything's done. And this makes it much easier for us working on HTML5 Boilerplate to update the library as well, because we just pull them down whenever the upstream project changes. And one of the consequences of writing this library was that it's become a very popular project in its own right. It's used by other frameworks like Twitter Bootstrap. YUI includes an option to include it now. TweetDeck uses it, but that's just because I worked on TweetDeck, so I made sure it used it. And a bunch of other projects. Guardian's new mobile app uses it. Audio, which is a streaming music service. And Medium, which is a new publishing platform by the co-founders of Twitter. And so yeah, many unrelated projects were using it. And we recently did something similar with the Apache server configurations that we bundle with HTML5 Boilerplate, which is that we always had an organization. This H5BP is like a super organization that that has many projects under it, and HTML5 Boilerplate is one of them. And we created this server configuration repo for various servers that aren't Apache, basically. And it used to be that these guys working on it would just mirror the features that people would put into the Apache configuration in HTML5 Boilerplate. But at some point, it just didn't make sense, basically. And it was clear that we should change it to allow all the people who are putting all the hard work into maintaining these things to decide their own future, to decide the future of the server configuration settings that we would use. So instead of us writing them into the Apache config in HTML5 Boilerplate, we just said, basically, you guys write your own spec, you're the experts, you're responsible for deciding what works and what doesn't, and like normalize, don't have it tied so strictly to HTML5 boilerplate, go your own way, and then we'll pull in the Apache configuration as a part of our dependencies, basically. And so part of that was allow the project to evolve down its own road. The node, it's not on here, but it's like it'd be on the bottom, as like the node config has been pulled out into its own repo again, because this makes it easier to install with Node's package manager. And this is kind of taking its own path now, and we just consume it like we would any other dependency. But the benefit of this is that we get to talk regularly to the guys who work predominantly on this, because many of them originally worked on HTML5 boilerplate code, and we say, this is what people want, and they're telling us like problems that they're having or whatever, and so we still have like open communication with them. And so the interesting thing about all of this work is that HTML5 boilerplate is much smaller now than it used to be when it first came out. So this is data from the diff between version 1 and version 4.1, which is where we're at now, which shows that we've had like about 1,000 additions and nearly 13,000 deletions. And so a significant reduction in scope of the project. And despite that, or probably because of that, the project's more popular than it has ever been, probably. So yes, we've gone through this progressive reduction in scope, a looser coupling of dependencies, and the core project is now more focused and deals with fewer issues directly. And many of the other problems we don't have to bother maintaining anymore because we just allow the other libraries to deal with that. And part of this thing of having fewer features in the core projects, it means that we can avoid scope creep, which is difficult when you have more features coming into a project, but the same number of people maintaining it. Like resources are spread more thinly, it weakens the focus, it's no longer clear exactly what the project is trying to do. And this is a common problem for many projects. So this is Mark Otto, who's one of the co-creators of Bootstrap, which is this really popular project, the most popular project on GitHub. Like nearly 50,000 people have started. And this project gets a huge number of issues and requests. And Mark and Jacob Thornton, who both of them used to work at Twitter, they have to deal with all of this, and they're primarily the only two people who are doing so. And the sheer weight of the requirements can be quite difficult to manage, as well as deciding where to take this large project. And especially when you have so many people invested in it, I suppose the fear of taking a wrong turn, like the potential consequences of that, can be quite overpowering. And so maybe we're lucky in that we had the ability to split HTML5 boilerplate into smaller projects. Standalone projects, but a key win for us was definitely this limiting of scope. And it had some interesting side effects, which, as I mentioned, with the server configuration setting, the build script, and with normalize, is that each of these projects can take on a life of their own and kind of become useful to people outside of our project, which is consuming them. So this also makes it much easier to replace them with alternatives. If we still had a build script as its own thing, we could switch it out for a Node script. We can switch out, if everyone stops using Apache tomorrow and starts using something else, we can replace that. It's not really very difficult at all. And this is a problem, this is a pattern that we're using more and more at Twitter, I think, as well. So we open sourced our type ahead solution, which is the autocomplete that we use on twitter.com. Flight, which is an event-driven framework that forms the basis of twitter.com's JavaScript now. And that framework is so well designed that apart from the fact that we could just completely decouple it and release it open source, we also just dropped it straight into TweetDeck, which is a client-side rendering app, whereas twitter.com is server-side, and it could work in either. And as part of the problem with breaking all these things up, though, is you have to create tooling to help manage all these smaller components, and that's something that we've also done, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So yeah, limiting scope, sharing responsibility around, tackles more problems in isolation, and allowing other projects to depend on these shared solutions means less maintenance. And any good software has to be maintained in order to avoid the accumulation of technical debt and just to make sure that you're kind of keeping pace with what people want from things. Maintaining an open source project in particular exposes you to a lot of pressures. And initially, you get this influx of help from people. You'll get people submitting issues about bugs, helping you patch problems, making suggestions, pointing out problems in your design philosophy, perhaps. But then quickly, and especially on GitHub, this project maintenance can become as much about managing people and their expectations as it is about code. So you get people who turn up and they'll be reporting very vaguely on something, hey, something's broken, and then gone, never to return. You'll have people who open duplicate issues, like so many duplicate issues, without checking previous reports. People won't read contribution guidelines, so as much effort as you've done to try and explain to people, this is what we expect of you. GitHub's UI isn't great at surfacing that, so people will just not read them. You'll get terrible commit messages that you wouldn't want in your logs at all. Strangers will complain that you didn't include their patch and they don't think your reasons are valid. Opinionated people will turn up and basically just say, hey, I replaced all your JavaScript with CoffeeScript. And you'll get very experienced people who will come in and go, this entire project is like fundamentally flawed. And all of these and more. And so you spend a large amount of time planning about how to defend against these situations coming up over and over and over, because it's not so much a problem that they appear once or twice. It's when the same problem repeats itself many times. In the same way that you don't want to be dealing with that over and over in your code, like when you're dealing with humans, trying to make sure that you can avoid this repetition is also very useful. And so this forces you to do many things, and one of which is to appreciate the fact that when someone does bring something up again for like the 100th time, that perhaps when they're bringing it up this time, the person bringing it up is bringing it up for a good reason, which is that the context has changed and that you maybe need to reassess this thing that you maybe rejected for valid reasons in the past, but today not so much. So it can lead to good changes in your project, as long as you basically don't apply your assumptions as to why this person is opening the project based on all the previous times people have opened it. You have to try and assess every complaint on its own merits at the time. The other one is it teaches you to try and to become a better communicator, both with the rest of the people in your team and with the people who are submitting problems, patches, issues, trying to make sure that even if someone does submit like a stupid patch the first time, that person might go on to become one of your best contributors in the long term. And so you have to make sure that they understand, like in a friendly way, why it is that you're not including a patch at a certain time. And it forces you to better document things, to get a better idea of where you and the rest of your code developers want the project to go as well. A lot of the time, all the effort that you put into resisting changes helps to inform what you all think of the project as in itself. So if you had very like hand-wavy goals initially, they can become more concrete. I think plenty of those things can be incorporated into corporate setting. And probably the most important one is to write documentation, like early as well. So as soon as you want other people to use your code, or they already are, then you should have good documentation. Because open source software in particular, you become used to doing this because if you don't have documentation, then no one's going to use it, basically. No one's going to come up to your project and see like a README with nothing in there and then be prepared to dig through and work out what your APIs are. So because it's very painful to work with repositories or libraries that don't have documentation, this kind of forces people to do it. And without documentation, like it slows the productivity of new people. And this is particularly obvious in a corporate setting where someone comes along, hi, how do I use this service that I don't know, go and talk to like Bob down the corridor. And then Bob repeats the same thing he repeats to everyone. So it makes people feel stupid because they have to go like asking for how to do things. It limits good contributions early on because people have to spend a lot of time getting up to speed with something by talking to other people rather than being able to read some comprehensive documentation. And it's very frustrating for the maintainers or the creators of these libraries because they find themselves repeating the same thing over and over and over. So I guess if you are someone who created something, when someone asks you a question, like write it up, put it into the documentation, then point someone to it, and then hopefully your documentation can improve over time. But it's our responsibility as like professional developers who write software to make sure that it's properly documented so that others can use it. And managing software complexity is a very important part of keeping a project efficient. That's hard to do if no one knows how to use your software, when no one knows like the scope within which your software has been created. It's very easy to suggest new features when there's no clear indication of like what the limits of your project are. So READMEs tend to be quite a good place to explain like the design principles of your library or your project, its goals, quick start guide, how to install things and whatnot. But that's probably about it. More complete documentation tends to live somewhere else. Traditionally, this has been wikis. GitHub, this open source place, has the wiki feature, which a lot of projects use for documentation. And most companies have their own internal wikis. Twitter has its own wiki where we put all that stuff. But I think wikis have some major problems. And that is that, first of all, someone needs to know where to find the relevant page on the wiki. Then someone has to remember to update it. And if you're using an older version of the project, the chances that the wiki match the code that's in V1 of the project when it's like at V4 now are quite slim. And then you have to hope that you can do some like archaeology through the wiki and find the right revision of the wiki that matches the precise version that you're using, which is difficult. And there's very little chance of having offline access. Whereas if you've got some code that you've installed on your machine, the chances are that you can still work with it when it's offline. So we experienced all these problems and more in HTML5 Boilerplate. And what we did was we moved all the documentation into the repo itself. So we took everything in the wiki, cleaned it up, put it in a docs folder in the root. And this means that it's available to anyone. Now they can view it offline. If I check out V1 of the project, well, not V1 because it doesn't have it, but when V10 comes out and I check out V4, then I'll have all the docs that are perfectly lined up with that. And when people download a zip ball of our project, the documentation is in there. It's exactly synced up with what they're after. And this massively reduced the number of issues that we were getting around documentation, which were mainly stuff like, oh, the docs say this, but the project is different. Like this file doesn't even have the same name. And in order to make these sorts of decisions about who moves, like where the documentation lives, what the scope of the project is, it's important to have like a clear and identifiable group of core developers. So these are the like top committers on HTML5 Boilerplate. And so despite the fact that this project has like 20,000 watchers and has been around for like 3 years, there's only three people with more than 50 commits. And these are the only people with more than 10 commits on the whole project. Well, that doesn't tell the story of like exactly the type of work that's being committed, because some of us commit a lot of library code, so we just replace jQuery and we get this, oh, look at all the diff work, but it's nothing really compared to people who are working on significant technical or architectural changes to the code. And these are the contributors to Bootstrap, which is much more popular than HTML5 Boilerplate in terms of like raw number of watchers. And that has only 7 people who've made more than 10 commits, and only 2 people who've made more than 50 commits. And if you look at the top 2 people, like Mark Otto has made more than double the number of commits of the next person. So all the work is done by a very small number of people. And jQuery is similar, has a slightly bigger spread, 24 people with more than 10 commits, 14 people with more than 50. And as I started looking into more and more, into larger and larger projects that have been around for longer and longer, what was interesting is like server-side, like server languages seem to have a greater number of contributors and more people who have done more commits, possibly because of that community's older. But when you look at something the size of like Linux, which has, at least from the data that I read, over 1,000 developers make commits for any particular version. Over 200 companies are involved in contributing to that, to any version in particular, or the most recent versions. But for a project of that size and the number of people using it and the kind of importance that it has for like global infrastructure of things, it's not really that many people, especially when you look into the details and you see that 20% of all changes are made by the top 20 contributors. And so I'm not exactly sure what these numbers mean, but when you think about there's this huge sea, like millions of developers consuming open source projects, and very few of them ever have any activity on these projects in terms of like submitting source code. Bootstrap basically has 2 people working on it. And HTML5 Boilerplate for a long part of history has had like 3 or 4 people working on it. So this might be why these projects work well, is because they have a small core of people, like opinionated dictators, if you want, who decide where things go. And that doesn't mean that there's a barrier, which means no one else can contribute. It just means that in order to have a direction, you have to have a small number of people who can decide that direction, whether it's right or wrong, rather than a huge number of developers like swimming in a sea of design by committee. And so yes, all these significant technical decisions and features are largely driven by experienced maintainers or very experienced developers who come in from the outside and kind of know what they're doing. So this is the general thing, I suppose. Like maintainers or the people who work on projects are not just there as like code reviewers or people who just kind of sit there and kind of shepherd a project into stagnation. They're actually the people who kind of make sure that it can survive. And I guess if there is a project that is stagnating with its core developers, then someone will come from the outside and try and like drive it in a new direction. And this is something that I think is particularly relevant to like corporate environments as well, which is that if you break the larger problem that everyone is aiming for into smaller pieces, then you end up, or you should end up possibly, with teams who work on like core infrastructure code, in particular for the front end as well these days. and that should be their only job. And Twitter kind of has this as well. We have a team called WebCore, and they worked on Flight, which is the JavaScript library framework that we have, and a variety of other things. They talk to the back-end guys about what they need, the interface between the front end and the back end. And then, so they create this stable platform from which other developers can build product features upon. This helps to limit the build-up of technical debt, obviously. But having said all of that, it's really important to make sure that you distribute the workload amongst a group of trusted collaborators. And some of the hardest things that you can do, both in open source and internally, I think, is get a group of people who buy into your project and who will help kind of give it some longevity. This is one thing that perhaps Bootstrap hasn't done so well with having basically 1.5 maintainers, which is that, say, tomorrow Mark gets bored and leaves and just I'm done with this project, I've got something else to do. Then the project might be slightly rudderless. This is a very difficult thing. We struggle with this with HTML5 Boilerplate as well. Paul and Divya, the original kind of creators, did a really good job of bringing other people in, like me. And so they don't really work so much on it anymore, even though there's been a continuity and most people still think that Paul is the only person working on it, which is fine, but I mean, it shows, I guess, what a good job he did of making sure that there was smooth transition of people. And so finding these co-maintainers early on is important but difficult work. You won't have time to maintain all the code yourself, so you have to delegate it out to other people. And this is where, I guess, documentation and stuff like that comes back, and it's really important, because if you want to bring people in at the early stages, but you don't have any documentation to get them up to speed and things, then it's going to be much harder for those people to invest the time necessary to kind of get over that barrier to entry and stick around. The other thing about making sure that you have maintainers who join, like I said, especially on internal projects as well, is that you want to avoid disruption if any of the core team leaves. So if you have a feature that becomes part of your front-end architecture, let's say, and then half that team decides to leave for whatever reason, it can be a really big problem if you have if they haven't passed their knowledge on, whether in the form of documentation or shepherding new people into the project. And so you have to have other people who are ready to step in, otherwise you might be in trouble. Relying on superstars, individual superstars, is not the best thing to do in the long run. And instead, to help both the project and to make sure that the company is in good shape, you should kind of encourage those people to shepherd other people in and kind of explain what's going on and make sure that new perspectives are part of that project. So yes, good co-maintainers can help minimize the loss of knowledge from a company when people leave. It's crucial to the longevity of the project, makes others want to be involved and all that stuff. And so one of the things that I discovered when I moved to San Francisco, thanks to my girlfriend who worked in volunteering in San Francisco, is she was explaining why she enjoyed volunteering so much more than she did her normal job back in the UK. And that's basically because when you think about what volunteering is, they have to source people who aren't paid, who give up their spare time, who want to do something good with their time, and who want to feel good about doing it. And the thing about feeling good about doing it is really important. Volunteering isn't just about, I slog through this hell in order to make the world a better place, because very few people are actually like that. So these volunteer organizations have to retain good volunteers or their entire organization disappears. They're fundamentally reliant on it. And their entire cause can be sunk based on the fact that they can't retain good people. It also means they can't be complacent in the way that perhaps we can be in corporate roles, which is that because I pay someone money, they're going to stick around because they don't have that luxury of people weighing up, well, money versus poverty. It's just all they have is people who want to give up their time. So one of the things that they do is give other people responsibility. So if you want people to stick around, especially in volunteering, but I think this is true for all the work that we do as well, you can't micromanage every volunteer or make them feel that they're just a cog in your machine. People want to feel that they're making a difference and that they can apply themselves as humans to improve whatever work it is that they're involved in. And so yeah, generally giving people responsibility and trusting them to do things themselves. This is one way to motivate people and to give them control over their own contributions. The other thing they do is they make people feel appreciated. And it's hard to underestimate how valuable this is, but how infrequently it's done as soon as you start giving people paychecks. And I've seen how nonprofit organizations in San Francisco treat their volunteers, which is like a never-ending stream of telling people what a great job they're doing, that the work they're doing making a difference, that they couldn't do it without them, that please can you bring your friends, thank you. It's amazing how often you don't hear that when someone doesn't have to say that to keep you sticking around. And so yes, because this is free time, and open source software is very much like working on your free time, and it's not a job, some of those factors are the same. What's to say an excellent developer comes in to work on your project? Like, how do you keep that person sticking around? Why should they work on your project rather than the 10,000 other projects out there with their free time? This is something that I think we can learn from in our professional jobs as well, which is that just because you pay someone doesn't mean that they're happy. It doesn't mean that they feel appreciated. And it doesn't mean that they feel motivated to work on your company code or to make it as good as possible. A lot of people will spend time working on open source software as a way to get those feelings. Maybe open source in general sprang up in large part because people didn't want to just be given a check and told to do what someone else told them to do. And so that feeling of being in control of your own work is really important. And if you can replicate that in a corporate setting, then I think that will definitely pay off. So yes, people are not just hanging around doing good things unless there's a good reason for them to do so. And this is especially relevant when you consider how scarce engineering talent is and how people, even if you give someone a great technical challenge and a paycheck, there's not enough in the long term to keep them hanging around. So HTML5 Boilerplate. We made a lot of mistakes, and many of the things that I've spoken about are actually, I guess, lessons learned from some of those mistakes and the ways we tried to go about correcting them. I think one of the things that was our strength was an ability to carry out relatively good failure analysis, which is we chatted a lot online, we discussed a lot of issues in public, and we always tried to look back and see what it was that we were doing wrong or choices that we made, whether we were certain of them or not, and whether or not they were the right call when we look back upon it. Another one is also listening out to see, like, what are people telling us that we're missing? You can kind of roll along, closing all these issues. No, you don't know what you're talking about. Shh. And then you forget the fact that amongst all of that noise, and as much as you try not to impose your own assumptions upon all these new people who come up, you are making mistakes and you're missing things that people are telling you, and you're not really listening. Another one is what development practices are coming up that we've overlooked, or what's coming down the future that we should be looking out for and thinking, like, planning ahead towards. Some of the key mistakes that we did make were, like I said, we started too big, so it's probably best to start small. We were too opinionated for the original aims of the project, which was to be boilerplate code. And we created much too much work for maintainers. Work completely unrelated to the core source code of the project in many ways. We had our website, which we used to distribute kind of version packages, was a complex project in itself. It had half a dozen, maybe 9 translations. Everything was using sub-modules to clone our documentation wiki and output it onto the page. And up until about 6 months ago, when I just threw away the whole website and started again, we were still serving version 1 of the project to some languages, like Indonesian visitors and things like that. So we just couldn't keep up with all the stuff we had to do. So part of that work was making it easier for us to maintain by having fewer things to take care of. And despite all these things that I said about how you find good contributors and all that, we still struggle to have people join the project. Same problem I guess Bootstrap have. Popularity is no indicator of success. And I've thought a lot about how this works, and perhaps releasing a project as a ta-da, finished style thing is a way to create a barrier to entry, because people see it as a group of people who have created something and are basically sharing it, but mainly for bug reports and things. Whereas if you release something early, and I suppose this is the same internally, right? And you have something that is not finalized, kind of slightly broken, people feel there's plenty of space for them to explore, to help, to make patches, to make a difference when there's still a chance to do so. And perhaps that's a way to make sure that you get better contributions. Yes, and the future of the project. So I guess part of the problem with getting new contributors is that at the moment the project is described as pretty stable, which I think is possibly concerning when you think about how rapidly the front-end environment that we're working in is changing. And I wonder sometimes if stable is just another word for stagnant. And so this might be the last point at which the project is quite stable before it undergoes like another round of change. And hopefully in that kind of chaos, then new people come in, they're like, oh, you're using this tool that I know of. Well, I can help you out with this. And as soon as people stop contributing and things stop changing, probably a chance that things aren't going in the right direction. Or at least that you need to start experimenting again. And so part of that, what we're going to be doing next is like dropping IE6 and IE7 support. I'd like us to look into having an automated build process rather than just like manually managing source code and distributing like the actual source code as the thing that other people consume. And to continue to break the project up into smaller parts where that's appropriate. And the reason that I'm thinking about these things is because of the way that the front end like tooling and workflow is changing. And Node has had a big impact on this. So workflows and tooling have shifted more and more into Node-based tools, which means that front-end developers can work on them. And they're no longer so much of a mystery. And three of those tools that are most prominent at the moment and that I'd like to explore using an HTML5 boilerplate are Yo, Grunt, and Bower. And these tools are used increasingly at companies like Google and Facebook, and open source projects like AngularJS and jQuery rely on them. So the first I'm going to talk about quickly is Bower, which is a package manager for the web, which we built at Twitter to help deal with these small components that we're writing. And it's a fairly generic solution to the problem of front-end package management, which is easy to incorporate into more opinionated build stacks. So again, it's this idea of not trying to be too opinionated at first, but provide something simpler that other stacks can build on top of. And it currently runs simply over Git, although that might change. And you can distribute any type of asset, so like images, CSS, JavaScript, whatever you want really in the front-end world. Yes, it's an increasingly important part of what we're doing at Twitter. Helps us manage dependencies between projects that are all consuming shared code, I suppose. Another one is Grunt, which is a JavaScript task runner, which is a great tool for automating tasks like minification, compiling assets, unit testing, linting, like many things like that, useful in CI as well. And we use this at TweetDeck. So TweetDeck is an app that gets distributed as a web app, has a wrapper for OS X, a wrapper for Windows, and a wrapper for Chrome. And we just use Grunt to automate the building of all of these things now. We used to use a Python script, but it meant that we'd always have to like pester the backend guys, and there were only 2 of them at the time, and they're working on really important things, and you're like, excuse me, like an image hasn't been copied over properly. Just felt stupid to waste their time like that. So we ported it to at least JavaScript, which means like the whole of the front end team could work on it, and that was I think that was a big win. And so yes, if we use a tool like Grunt with HTML5 boilerplate, it would mean that we could separate the package that we distribute to people or to other frameworks that they might want to include in their toolkit from the process of creating it, which is exactly how jQuery works as well. jQuery is broken up into a whole bunch of smaller modules, and then they have a build step that automates the production of jQuery.js and jQuery.min.js. And the final piece of the puzzle is this command line tool called Yo, which is a Google project. And it's inspired by the Rails generator pattern. So you basically install generators using Node's package manager, and then use Yo to scaffold out things like a web app or boilerplate code, that is, or backbone models and things like that. So I can imagine a world in which HTML5 boilerplate might use Bower to manage all of these like little modules that we're building, and then other tools like Yo might want to make use of HTML5 boilerplate, perhaps even as a Bower package to generate HTML5 apps for people. So rather than going to your website and downloading a zip file, you just automate it with a command line tool like Yo, HTML5 boilerplate, and there you go, you're off. So many of the things that I was saying about documentation and communication apply across these projects as well, because many of these projects are either being worked on or originally authored by people who used to work on HTML5 boilerplate. And some of us contribute to those projects, and we're constantly talking to those guys and like, what are your plans with Yo? Like, what is it that you want people to do? How can we make our project fit with what you're trying to create as a modern workflow? Which I think is a really nice way of making sure that we expose a wider audience to our project's ideas, and we make sure that we can kind of align ourselves with where other people are going as well. And the other thing that we try and align ourselves with is the future of the web platform. And it's always a delicate balance between creating software that is aligned with the future and creating software that helps to shape what the future is. And I don't really know what the right balance is. Perhaps some projects should be experimental and try out completely new, like crazy ways that might become the future. But other projects will want to not deviate too far from that, because say in 5 years' time, the web platform has changed fundamentally and you've gone down a completely different road. Like the arc that you're going to have to take to come back towards the web platform is going to be significant. And one of the most interesting aspects of this is like the future of the web platform is web components. And web components is becoming a collection of specs, which has like specs for native templating in HTML, encapsulation of styles and scripts, custom elements, and you can apply custom UI and behavior, and including all these things via HTML imports. And as far as I've seen, like AngularJS is doing quite a good job of being like relatively closely aligned to this, perhaps because both of them are originated by Google people. And all this stuff is a long way off, but this is just to say the kind of the way that we're thinking on the project and the way that I think at work as well, of like how do we, like what's coming up and how do we make sure we don't deviate too much from that in order to make sure that our project survives in some form or other. And this is like my last point, which is that having a project which has its own destruction built into it at the core. So rather than, if you think about a problem that you're trying to solve and you create a library to solve it, there's a tendency, just based on the very fact that you've created an organization to solve this problem, that you will perpetuate that problem in some form in order to keep that project alive and keep the organization alive and to justify all the investment that people have put into this. And what we're actually doing with the HTML5 Boilerplate, although this was unintentional, I kind of think this is just what we're doing by looking at looking at the history of the project, is kind of building the destruction of HTML5 Boilerplate into the project's core, which has gone from the big monolithic template with build scripts and test libraries to allowing those things to be decided by other projects, to putting the CSS into its own bucket, to separating out the server configuration files. And maybe the trajectory of the project is to evaporate completely into just a cloud of components and different dependencies. And then HTML5 Boilerplate itself will become an opinionated project that assembles a collection of dependencies, in effect, in a way that we think is a nice starting point. And that's something that I hope no one else is afraid of. I'm definitely not afraid of it in terms of what for HTML. I mean, other people working on HTML5 Boilerplate aren't afraid of. Because I think that's the general thing of like, just adapting your project isn't enough. You have to be prepared to experiment quite a lot to be prepared to maybe say goodbye to your project completely, if that's the way that things are going. Because the alternative to that is just to have a project that stagnates and atrophies. So yeah, that's it. Done. Do I do questions? Does anyone have any questions?
Do you have any suggestions for your approach to introducing open source commitments into a corporate environment? So, strategies where like 20% of your time, or the employees just go to open source projects that are, viewed as useful to the corporate environment. Do you have any thoughts?
I haven't worked long enough at somewhere like Twitter to know, to give you a good answer to that. I know that there are people there. We have an open source manager who his job is to try and help open source stuff that people are working on at Twitter and identify projects that might be suitable for open sourcing. So we open source things across like the whole stack in the company. And some of it will be like Flight, the event-driven architecture that we wrote. Well, I didn't write, but someone at Twitter wrote. I think that was maybe perhaps always designed to be open sourced. There's definitely a strong culture of developers who want to open source things. Like Bootstrap, Twitter's been pretty successful open sourcing work, especially because if you can make it clear to the people who decide these things that by open sourcing work, not only do you get like extra visibility for your company, so Google, Twitter are all generally good at that, but also it's a great way of sourcing people because I'm not particularly special, but Twitter open source Bootstrap and I was interested in helping them patch some bugs, and that led to them identifying me as someone who would be possibly a good fit for their company. And we continue to do that, see people contributing to projects like Bauer that we're open sourcing or whatever, and we go like, is this person might be a good fit because the person already working on our code in effect, right? And they're working with people who work here, and people like to work with them. So the benefit is not just to be like some benevolent open sourcing company, but also to make sure that you provide a platform that provides you with better candidates that come and work for you. Does that help? All right, I think that's it. Thanks.